Hello, welcome to episode number 2 of Hobby Think Tank. I'm Danny Black, and I am joined by the infamous John Keating. Honored to be working with you today, John. How you doing?
Hey, Danny, how are you? It's like 7 minutes in heaven, just you and I.
Well, hopefully it'll only feel like 7, but we'll make it longer.
My hands are warm. Don't worry.
Um, Today we're talking, does the vintage label matter? We love that vintage label. People love to talk about 1948 to 1980, give or take everybody on your own thing. We're going to get into all of it, but as kind of a basis for where we're starting, does the vintage label from 48 to 1980 matter? And I think both of us have some pretty strong opinions on this. For information's sake, John is 10 years older than me. And so we do get a little different perspective here, and I think that's kind of cool. So uh, I'm ready to kick this off. And how do you feel about that vintage label?
I'm going to read from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, where the noun version says vintage means a period of origin or manufacture. Okay. Or a collection of contemporaneous and similar persons or things. The adjective is dating from the past, of old, recognized and enduring interest, importance, and quality. Nowhere in any of my internet's research does it say it's a sliding scale. So I don't care
Well,
what your
is
DMV says, Danny Black. This isn't the DMV.
well,
This is
that was exactly going to be my point. It is the antique car gets the label on the license plate that says vintage, but it has to be, and I think it's probably, I don't know if it's a national or state by state, but it's typically 20, 30 years, and you call it vintage. Does that label matter when I'm driving a car? No. When my car turns 30 years old, am I running out to get a new label? No. But if I want to buy and say I'm a vintage card collector, what be the harm of putting that label on my collecting? That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, but does that not lead to even more confusion in our hobby for recent entrants or people that are have inherited items that they want to get rid of and whatnot? So there's a definition, and it doesn't hurt to define the different eras of our hobby and leave it at that instead of them being on a sliding scale and everybody having to readjust and all that fun stuff.
Well, I recently had a conversation about, I guess we'll call it the last 5 or 10 years, with more parallels, more grading, and what will this era eventually be looked at, in hindsight. So if we're not on a sliding scale, how do you look at the different eras yourself, or how would you educate if you're talking about new entrants? What would that be?
Well, I think people of my specific generation who grew up collecting in the 70s, almost to a person, probably abide by 1980 and back being vintage. And obviously, we were all affected by the entrance of Fleer and Donruss into the hobby, or into the baseball, football, basketball, hockey end of things eventually. So that's easy. I mean, I think that's where we defined, or where the line was drawn, either by us or for us, and it makes sense. It makes sense to everybody, I think, right on paper. Now, I can understand why people want to redefine that, um, but there's a lot of things that happen there beyond just the entrance of Fleer and Don Ross into the mainstream, and that's happened on the field, happened off the field, happened by the manufacturers and the way we collect and all that fun stuff.
What was the first time you heard or used the word vintage related to your own collecting?
I would not, and that's part of these. That's part of the joy of all this is we don't. When's the first time you heard the term classic rock? I
Right.
don't. I don't know, right? And I know that now there's classic rock radio stations in every city, and classic rock will have Nirvana, it'll have Coldplay, it'll have all those fun.
That
But I guarantee you, '98 rock was not considering newer music back down there in Baltimore back in the '80s. They weren't playing Guns N' Roses on classic rock stations.
So that's the best argument I've ever heard against some sort of sliding scale. And when we say sliding scale, we mean once things are 20 or 30 years old, automatically you would call them vintage. But that's the best argument I've ever heard, because as somebody who is a classic rock fan, nothing irks me more than to, hear, well, I like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but somebody else.
Yeah, but they have their own, let them. They have alternative rock, is what they call them.
Well, and
back
and,
in the
and,
day,
and that's
right?
why Sirius has grunge rock, and where you can wear your flannel and listen,
Right,
and
exactly, and that's
but
fine. Yeah,
we don't. But
modern
you're
rock,
right. If
modern
somebody
rock.
calls that classic rock, or if my kids call that classic rock,
Right,
I probably educate them.
right.
So, so then what do we do? What is the way to refer? If I want to collect that 48 to 80 era, and that's for a couple different reasons, and on the manufacturing also.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're going to probably do a much better education kind of on the about that. But what do I call that?
Vintage, baby. Yeah, I mean, at the 48 to 80 vintage, we can have subgenres. If you want to call 50s and 60s classic, that's awesome. But keep in mind some of the things that were going on here, right? We had players in what we would probably all call the classic heyday of collecting, the 50s and the 60s. A lot of those players made their way into the 70s. Okay, Banks and Aaron and Mays and Clemente, Gibson, at least two Robinsons. They all played throughout.
But the rookie card is king.
The rookie card is king, but keep in mind that these guys were overlapping with the next wave of Hall of Famers like Yastrzemski and Brock and McCovey and all these. That 60s was the sweet spot where the 50s players and the 70s players kind of overlapped, and then it kind of goes away after that. Nobody's fallen in love with the rookie cards. I mean, George Brett rookie card is awesome, but it is what it is, and it's not going to be a 4-figure card for the most part, unless you have a really cherry example. It's just it's a nice way to button up that long era of collecting, the 50s, the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and then we have the other manufacturers entering. We have the manufacturers offering us updates and traded sets. The rookie card thing kind of blew up in the 80s. So it's a really nice, a really nice little way to button up one era and begin another one right there in 1981 for the manufacturers, the factory sets, the updates, the rookie craze, all that fun stuff. And now I've spoken to you about certain things that happened then too, right? Like, in the 70s, there's no logos on the football helmets. And that comes back in the early 80s.
And that means it's unlicensed. That means there's not a
Right.
contract between the cards in the league.
Right. There's that stuff. Basketball kind of goes away in the early 80s for a couple of years, right? So to me, there's a definite ending of eras and a beginning of a new era. Gretzky's the last big bang of the hockey cards, but for the most part, hockey cards were kind of way under the radar for many years, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then they have a bit of a resurgence in the 80s. I mean, hockey collectors are not a huge percentage of our hobby, but it kind of, like I said, there's enough smoke around that era, 79, 80, 81 for us to be able to put one era to bed and wake another one up.
Well, to the original question, does it matter at all? Or are we, as hobby people who like to organize?
Exactly. Right. We're, you've heard it a million times by people that are a lot more, bigger entities in the hobby than I am, saying most of us like to make order out of chaos. So a sliding scale invites more chaos into this thing. And I understand one of the, I mean, no offense to your generation, because I think the JWE folks, my friend Cooter calls them Max Waxers, that grew up in that certain time, you guys kind of run the show now, right? Like, I think in numbers, the junk wax era kids that came up, I think you guys are a majority of the collectors at this point. So I think that it's kind of like a middle child syndrome, right? The Jan Brady thing where, I look at the junk wax era very
Did you
affectionately.
just Jen Brady me?
I'm from the 70s, man. I'm here to
All right, I'm
reach
going to
down from the 70s.
respectfully let you finish your sentence, but then
All
we're
right,
going to
man.
address this
All right.
Marsha. Come on.
So, we talk about junk wax era, and just I think the name is put off to some people, but I look at it very affectionately, right? It was a wonderful time. We had no idea what was going on. We didn't call it the junk wax era back then, right? Until later on. So I think that there's an undercurrent to kind of want to dilute that terminology a little. So some people are thinking, well, it's not going to be junk wax; it'll be vintage soon, and we're moving into vintage. You go to Facebook Marketplace, and you see Cal Ripken vintage cards for sale, and Tony Gwynn vintage cards, and Boggs, Gwynn, Mattingly, Ripken. They're never going to be vintage. Michael Jordan. There was a show that had talking about Michael Jordan vintage cards. The only Michael Jordan vintage cards I know of is for report cards. Okay. Otherwise, you're not going to find a Michael Jordan vintage card.
I will say, to your point about the quality of Hall of Fame talent in the 70s, that Ripken and Gwynn, and probably, because they're a year or two off, and I understand that you had Flair and Dunruss starting production, so they both have multiple rookie cards, all legitimate. But I think because of the small Hall of Fame theory, people want to attach them, and maybe this backs up your point. They want to attach them to the better quality Hall of Famers, right. And maybe that defends exactly kind of what you're saying. Is it's there's something beyond just the year of the sliding scale.
Yeah, the 70s aren't immune to criticism either with the players. I mean, Michael Schmidt had some great years in the 70s, but the meat of his career was that turn going into the 80s. Palmer, Eddie Murray, Brett, all those guys.
No, I'm saying rookie cards in the 60s whose careers were in the 70s.
Right. So it's, we come to one of the problems that we find, and we talk about the collectability of a player is there was maybe a card, maybe an all-star card, and if your player was really good year after year, you'd have a league leader card, right? Nowadays, or I'm sorry, when Fleer came out, there was a couple of Schmitz in there, was a couple of Roses just in that thing, right? And then Don Ross, and then we had Topps. So you went from getting like a pair of cards from your favorite player to getting a dozen cards from your favorite player.
I actually think it kind of mirrors the communication. You're a early color TV era guy. I think
come on, man. I'm the thick of you're that.
No. You are Norman Lear wheelhouse growing up. I can tell you those were your shows.
I'm a UHF kid. The only time we watched anything that wasn't on UHF was if it was at nighttime and it was Happy Days.
So we're that. Right. But
yeah, you're right.
What would you call the telephone? That's kind of your classic, kind of your pre-war, kind of your early vintage era. And what you're saying is now we're smartphones.
Yeah, well, I mean, the same thing you say videotape too. Everybody says I'm videoing this thing. Nobody's videoing it, right? We're putting it to tape, whatever.
But we need labels.
We need labels for sure, but we can give labels to early modern 80s, right? That's an easy one. Early modern 80s, junk wax era. I don't know what you're going to call post-junk, pre-modern, ultra modern or whatever, because it seems to be a bit of a dead zone in there, but it's like there's subcategories that are open for definition.
I also think they evolve. Like you said, nobody called junk wax during junk wax.
Right.
And nobody called vintage in the 50s or 60s.
Right. And I said to you before that we called them, like people my generation called old cards tobacco cards because we thought they were all tobacco cards. But turns out most of them were candy cards and gum cards, and we just didn't know any difference. My Goudies, I just assumed they were when I was 12 years old, I assumed I had one or two Goudies. I assumed that they were tobacco cards without knowing, even though it says chewing gum on the back, probably.
Okay, so I love the Strongsville, Ohio vintage show for a number of reasons. One of them is I am by 30, 40 years the youngest person in the room.
Okay.
And when I walk up to a table, and for people who don't know, this is they call it a vintage only show, and they use 1980. And I will walk up to a table, and 50% of the tables look at me and say, "We don't sell modern." Is there a stigma on the buyer? Is that why we have labels?
Well, listen, as I think we all can agree, no matter when you get into the hobby, and I think, I don't know whether it was Mike Moynihan, I don't want his head to get any bigger than it already is. We won't be able to find a hat for him, but somebody said nobody's born a vintage collector, which is true, right? Whenever your entry point in the hobby is most likely defined by whatever cards are out at that time. I love the 70s, but where do you go from there? You're caught up. If you buy all the stuff, 1980 comes out and you bought all the Topps cards, and I literally have thousands of 1980s Topps cards. What do you do from there? You go to a show, you have to go backwards. So uh, the great thing about the hobby is there's plenty of room to go backwards.
Well, that's the
And
graduating. That's the
and I don't
graduating
know,
theory.
yeah, and I don't know why any dealer would say that, because it seems to be, and I can understand what you're saying. I mean, I can envision it happening, but it's like everybody eventually makes their way back. Some people skip the 80s, some people skip the 70s. There's plenty of folks I know of that are half my age that are well more versed on vintage cards or pre-war cards than I am. And I think I don't, my generation isn't, I'm not trying to be territorial of the term vintage. I'm just trying to,
It feels that way.
I'm trying to reestablish or reaffirm what most of us know to be an industry standard of an era. Otherwise, it's an open field for anybody to hunt in, and I think it's awesome because it opens the door to learning more about the history of the sports, regardless of what sport you're collecting, and you learn the history of individuals, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful gateway to expanding your knowledge. So I don't want to keep anybody out of the vintage, Danny. I just think we need to say this is the vintage era, this is the pre-war era, this is the modern era.
So I support calling pre-war. You said that when you grew up, vintage was, anything going back, that you didn't separate pre-war.
I guess you'd have to ask somebody older than I that question, right? Because obviously, as a 12-year-old, which I was in 1980, the last thing on my mind is, and it was a different time too. Keep in mind, in 79 was the first time I could pick up a book and see every card from every year as a name and a little box next to it to check off, right? Prior to that, anything I knew about old cards was typically from the 74 era or from the 74 Aaron specials, cards 1 through 6, or I guess 2 through 6, or the 75 MVP cards, stuff like that. Like there wasn't a lot of knowledge out there. So anyway, I got off track there, but I wouldn't know what those folks back then called the older cards. Again, I remember the term tobacco cards, but that seemed to be a generic thing for anything before the 50s.
I think Honus Wagner influences that card influences the way people look at that era, I think, from a generalization. But I think that's almost the 300 level. And not to, if vintage is graduating from 100 to 200, I do think pre-war, just because, and you are far better at this than I am, the types of companies that were making the cards, the advertising on the back where the fronts can be the same, there is such a whole different environment with the way printing was literally done and the way things were distributed. Mm-hmm. So getting back to your theory on why the adding Fleer and Dunros is kind of a line of demarcation, I'm going to say there's a line of demarcation also the other way, where it was a whole different production, and the reason they made the cards was different. The reason, or the way they made them, how they distribute them, all totally different than when you fast forward post-war.
Right. Well, some people say 73 back is vintage because of the series releases, right? But I think I haven't heard that one too much out in the wild, but we retooled in the '80s on how to collect. Uh, Beckett came along with a monthly magazine, and then the different sports and the different monthly magazines. And then the '90s were a wonderful time for, you know, I'd like to say that the sport of baseball grew unlike no other era than in the '70s for many reasons, on the field and off the field again. But the '90s expanded the hobby massively, not just in production, but design and the
Well,
possibilities, right?
Ken Burns says you're wrong, because Ken Burns talks about the 50s and 60s as kind of that magical era. So if I look at like Mickey Mantle, I mean, he's the gladiator of our sport. And that's,
Right.
one of the things where, every generation has their guy. So I think everybody likes watching who they grow up with. So that's why I think you have an affinity for the 70s. I have an affinity for a lot of the 80s players. And
I'm
I
not
think
saying the '70s are the golden age. I'm saying, dude, I'm saying free agency, AstroTurf, uh, all that stuff that happened. The uniforms changed, the whole game changed. The designated hitter, the whole thing changed. The players' union became more powerful, right? So we had strikes, and then and that played a role into more product being out there in the stores as well, whether they're discs and potato chip bags or Slurpee cups or whatever, like that had a role in collecting as well. And it changed the landscape of the business. Night baseball, night World Series games, all that stuff. The '70s changed the sport of baseball more than any other sport. I'll fight to the end on that. Ken Burns, you can at me if you want, but the golden age of baseball, we can argue about what that is, and I'd have to agree that the '50s were banging, right?
never challenge a man with that haircut.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Him and Mark Davis go to the same barber.
yeah, he'd be great in a Beatles tribute band, wouldn't he?
I
Ken
think
Burns.
that's called them. I think that's what the Monkeys were.
Yeah, the monkeys, right?
Uh,
Well, yeah, nobody masquerading as around town as Mickey Dolenz is gonna win that argument with me.
but it's so funny because you're such a historian, and to me, the labels kind of mirror the history. And so, do labels matter? Matter for what? Matter for us crazy people in the hobby that like to organize? Yes. Do they matter for what you actually do when you buy or sell a card? No.
So, well, what if the label on your card said PSA versus OPP? Would it matter?
Do you know me?
I said,
Um,
you know me.
so, I mean,
Labels do matter in this hobby, right?
well, but that creates a secondary market issue.
Right.
That to me is a different discussion.
But
Um,
but yeah,
but
I
does
mean
it?
that's a contrived. We talk about the contrived nature of this hobby sometimes, but
But is it
there's no,
contrived to?
that period of time. It's not contrived. It happened. It was a series of events that led to that, right? None of that was planned. It just wow,
The
look what happened in
50s
the
and
early '80s.
60s had team movement going west, a
Mhm.
lot of things that changed the game, that I could argue equally, or darn near the 70s. And so do you separate the 50s and 70s? Does it matter?
I don't do that, but you got a jacket on, so you must be smart, Danny Black. If you There's nothing in 1980 in collecting in the hobby that mirrors 1990, right? They're two different beasts. Complete. I
Okay.
mean, there's there's no commonality between those two years, a mere 10 years apart. Um, so that's why I think I think that's why we need a division. And I don't where I need, we don't need it, but that's why there is a division there, because it's not a holier than thou thing. It's just this is when this stopped and this is when this started and this is the line, and let's make a new side 2, right? Or side 3 or side 4.
So for
That's an
me,
LP reference for kids who grew up with record albums.
yes, they were big CDs.
Yeah.
Um, so I maybe I feel the way about the more modern era, which now they call just modern because it's not ultra
Right.
modern or super modern
Right.
or whatever. And I think all those labels are going to change. So, the question is, junk wax has been a great term for decades. Well, what happens when a bunch of these guys end up being Hall of Famers?
Well,
And I know that,
they are, but that's not. It's it. You know, I separate I separate the on field versus the off field. Like I don't define vintage by the players necessarily. I define it by what was going on in the hobby, right? Like I again, I will tell you that boy, that '50s era in baseball was unlike any other era, which is great. But that doesn't mean it can't fit into the vintage with the '70s or the late '40s or the '60s, whatever. I just think I'm defining it in hobby terms, not in sporting terms.
but in hobby terms, I look at junk wax as a more innocent, simplified world than when you hit modern. So to me, I say, great, there was only 3 sets. And now we're going from no Hall of Famers to,
There was
now
a
you're,
lot of sets in the '90s, Danny. You know that
well,
early
that's what
stuff.
I'm saying. But
Yeah,
I'm saying, but
yeah,
I'm saying, I think
yeah,
we're going to look back and change the
yeah.
names of the eras.
Sure.
Junk wax, I think, will no longer go into the '90s.
Yeah. Well, I think it'll stick, man. I think it's here to stay. And I tell other people, the kids growing up nowadays, I don't know whether your kids are into it, but the era hasn't been defined, whether it's going to be the C19 era, whether it's going to be the breaker era, uh, the parallel era, whatever. It's like we don't know what that is yet, right? We don't know. We don't know what it's called. And someday your sons or somebody's daughters are going to say those were the good old days, like I did in like I'm referring to 1980, you're referring to 1990. Somebody will refer to 2020 through 2022 as the good old days, right?
Yep. Isn't that almost a sliding scale?
Well, it is for them, but not in a hobby. It's a sentiment. It's a sentimental thing. It's a time in your life. It's not a time in the hobby, right?
Right. But when they take over the hobby, that's what it's going to be.
Well, that's what your gang's doing right now, the JWEs, right?
Well, to me, whether or not you think they should be in the Hall of Fame, I believe you're going to end up eventually with some of the steroid guys in the Hall of Fame.
They should all be in. They
So
should
let's
all
just
be in.
accept that
Yeah.
as it's going to be there. So when I start looking at what I thought was junk wax for all these years, now you're telling me I got a Ripken, a Gwen, a McGuire, a Bonds, a Clemens, and you start piling that much talent.
Right.
I do look at it differently, and I start looking at, population reports and how many tens are there really, because everybody thought they were worthless.
Right.
And you find out all of a sudden, well, heck, there's actually not that many tens.
Right.
And I hate to put the pressure on a 10 because that's certainly different than the cards in the 50s.
Right.
But once there's value, all of a sudden, that term junk wax, I don't know if it sticks.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Cooter says max wax. So maybe max wax is a wonderful term that everybody agreed to. That's not for me to decide. It's, I guess, for the hobby to decide, right? We need to, we're not, again, I'm not defining the players. I'm trying to define eras in the hobby, not eras in the sports, because it can go to, Ripken, Gwynn, Boggs. That's their side of things. What about Elway and Marino and Sanders, right? Those guys are in, and they are inner ring Hall of Famers, but they had a gajillion cards out there.
Do you consider junk wax for non-baseball based on production?
Oh, for sure. I can take you by your little hand, Danny, around the corner there and show you dozens of monster boxes with 91 Pro Set in there for football. Okay. Skybox basketball, Fleer basketball. I have thousands and thousands and thousands of junk wax basketball, football, and upper deck hockey cards, Pro Set hockey cards. So absolutely, because it's junk wax isn't defining the type of product they were putting out. It was defining the fact that so much product was put out. So it's like calling stocks penny stocks. You can buy a lot of stocks with $1.
Here's the difference in the perspectives. I remember growing up and not being able to buy basketball cards.
Right. Well, it was a distant third, probably at that point. That's why the Jordan non-vintage rookie card is so valuable, is because not a lot of people are hunting for. I mean, Jordan was a beast in 1986. Okay, he was an absolute beast, but not a lot of people were buying basketball cards back then, right? And then in the early 90s, that all changed. There was so many basketball cards, but they took their cue from baseball, which I think, the wave came a little earlier. Some say 86. I tend to think 87, but I don't know the numbers either. But somewhere in that range was baseball, and then later on, everybody else just jumped on board. Both the manufacturers that were doing it, and then new manufacturers as well.
All right. So the original question, does the vintage label matter?
I think it does to me, in that it defines that era and it clarifies that a 1977 Gary Carter or Andre Dawson rookie is a vintage card, and a 1981 Cal Ripken or a Cal Ripken XRC is not a vintage card. I think it's simple. I think it's quite simple. Thanks to Topps, thanks to Fleer, Donruss, and thanks to a whole bunch of other mitigating circumstances.
Well, I'll say for personal collecting, I like to organize. So I like labels for personal collecting. But my categories differ from the straight vintage, and I think I'm a product of my own environment. I kind of use, certain Baltimore demarcations as certain errors. But I think people in the hobby like to organize. So I'm going to say, does the label vintage matter? I think it does when you are communicating hobby language as a kind of universal language, but I don't know that it actually matters at all for buying or selling or collecting. To me, that the label's irrelevant. It's about the card.
Yeah, because those who know, right?
Yeah. And if you walk into a show, you might say, hey, is there a lot of vintage? And you don't really care if the person's defining vintage is whatever you just want to know if they're older cards, or stuff that you're going to like.
Right.
Fair?
Sounds good to me, but I'm just a vintage guy. What do I know?
Which is not true at all, by the way. At all. All right, Mr. Keating, any other thoughts on this before we put it to bed?
No, just, I know we don't like to label people in society, but it's not a harmful thing to label our various eras in the card and hobby business. So go get them. Go get some smelly vintage cardboard out there, folks.
I have always said the best-selling cologne that's never been made is Eau de Tops. So
no. Eau de Dealer. As long as you weren't going to say Eau de Dealer, that would have been bad, because dealers smell like an Arby's bathroom.
Yeah, and use New Balance. So, yeah. All right. Well, John, thank you for everybody watching or listening. I hope we got the think tank going a little bit and made you think about this topic in a different way than maybe you had before. So
let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yap at us.
Yep. And I believe you've already told Ken Burns to come at you. So we expect to hear from him, and we'll have reactions up next time.
Sweet.
All right. Thanks, everybody.